The icy water swirled around Natalie Armstrong's ankles as she fought to keep her balance, clutching her satchel tighter against her chest. The flood waters of the normally placid Silver Creek, now threatening to swallow everything in their path, including her hopes of reaching Loveland before nightfall. Colorado Territory, 1871. Natalie had never imagined her journey west would end with her stranded on a rapidly disappearing island of land, watching helplessly as the muddy waters of Silver Creek rose higher by the minute. The spring melt had come early and with unforgiving force, transforming the gentle stream that divided the land into a roaring, churning monster. "Keep moving higher," shouted an elderly man who had also been caught in the sudden deluge. He gestured wildly toward the small rise of land that seemed to be the only spot not yet claimed by the flood. Natalie gathered her sodden skirts and stumbled toward higher ground, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her entire life was packed in the satchel she clutched: letters from her late parents, the deed to property she had inherited in Loveland, and what little money she had to her name. She had traveled all the way from Philadelphia with dreams of starting anew, only to find herself facing death just miles from her destination. The small group of stranded travelers huddled together on the rise beside Natalie and the elderly man. There was a young mother clutching two small children, a rail, thin peddler, and a grim-faced ranch hand who kept scanning the far bank as if he could will himself across. "The water's still rising," the ranch hand muttered, his weather-worn face creased with worry. "Might reach us before nightfall at this rate." Natalie looked across the raging waters toward Loveland, so close, yet unreachable. Her new life, her fresh start after the death of her parents and the scandalous dissolution of her engagement, all seemed to mock her from across the flood. "Someone will come," she said, attempting to sound more confident than she felt. "Surely someone from town will realize travelers might be stranded." The ranch hand spat on the ground. "Maybe, but folks got their own troubles with this flood. Could be days before anyone comes looking." "Days we don't have," the peddler added, pointing to the rapidly shrinking island of dry land. As the afternoon wore on, the situation grew increasingly dire. The water continued to rise, and the small patch of high ground continued to shrink. The children were crying, hungry and frightened, and Natalie had given them the last of her bread hours ago. The spring sun was beginning its descent, and none of them relished the thought of spending a night exposed to the elements with the flood waters still rising. It was then, as hope began to fade with the daylight, that Natalie spotted movement on the far bank. Squinting against the glare of the setting sun on the water, she made out the figure of a man dragging what appeared to be a makeshift raft toward the water's edge. "Look," she cried out, pointing. "Someone's coming." The others turned to look, a ripple of renewed hope spreading through the small group. From across the raging waters, they watched as the man secured something to his belt, likely a rope, and pushed the raft into the torrent. Even from this distance, they could see he was powerfully built, expertly navigating the dangerous currents with long poles that he used to steer and propel the raft. "That's Preston Irwin," the ranch hand said, recognition in his voice. "Runs the Triple P ranch west of town. Toughest son of a," he glanced at the children and cleared his throat, "toughest man in the territory." Natalie watched, heart in her throat, as the man fought against the current. Each stroke of the poles looked like a battle against nature itself, the raft sometimes spinning in the whirlpools before he regained control. Several times, she was certain he would be swept away, but somehow he continued to make progress toward their increasingly desperate island. As he drew nearer, Natalie could make out more of his features: a strong jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard, eyes as blue and turbulent as the water he fought against, and hands that gripped the poles with determined strength. When he was within shouting distance, he called out, "How many?" "7," the ranch hand called back. "2 children," the man Preston nodded grimly. "Can only take 3 at a time, water's getting worse." He maneuvered the raft as close as he dared to their small island, throwing a rope which the ranch hand caught and secured around a half-submerged boulder. "Children and their mother first," Preston commanded, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man used to being obeyed. No one argued. The young mother, trembling with both fear and relief, was helped onto the raft with her children. As soon as they were settled, Preston untied the rope and began the perilous journey back to the far shore. Natalie watched, scarcely daring to breathe, as the raft bobbed and weaved through the churning waters. At one point it nearly capsized when it hit a submerged tree, but Preston's quick reflexes saved them. When they finally reached the opposite bank, willing hands helped the mother and children to safety. Without pause, Preston turned the raft around and began fighting his way back toward the stranded travelers. "He's coming back," Natalie whispered, a mixture of awe and gratitude filling her chest. The elderly man patted her arm. "Of course he is, miss. That's Preston Irwin. Man's word is as solid as the Rocky Mountains themselves." The second trip was even more harrowing than the first. The water had risen further, and new debris rushed downstream, creating additional hazards. But Preston navigated with the same determined skill, returning to their shrinking island of refuge. "You two next," he said, gesturing to the peddler and the elderly man. The elderly man shook his head. "Take the girl. I can wait." "Sir, I insist," Natalie began, but the old man cut her off. "Young lady, I've lived a full life. You still have yours ahead of you. Go." Natalie wanted to argue further, but the water was now lapping at their boots, and Preston's expression made it clear he would brook no delay. "Both of you, then," the ranch hand decided, practically lifting Natalie onto the raft. "I'll wait with him." He nodded toward the elderly man. The peddler scrambled aboard, and before she knew it, Natalie found herself clutching the edges of the crude raft as Preston pushed away from the island and into the churning waters. Up close, the journey was far more terrifying than it had appeared from shore. The raft dipped and rose with each swell, water constantly splashing over the sides, soaking Natalie to the skin. More than once, she was certain they would be overturned and swept away. Throughout it all, Preston remained focused, his powerful arms straining against the poles, his eyes constantly scanning for dangers in their path. Only once did he speak, a sharp "hold tight," before steering them through a particularly treacherous section, where the current formed a funnel between 2 partially submerged boulders. When they finally reached the far bank, Natalie's legs were so weak with relief that she stumbled as she stepped off the raft. Preston caught her arm, steadying her with a grip that was firm but surprisingly gentle. "Thank you," she breathed, looking up into his face for the first time. His eyes were even more striking up close, a deep blue that reminded her of the sky just before dusk. "Stay here," was all he said before turning back to the raft, preparing for his third journey. "Wait," Natalie called after him. "The water's getting worse. Is there someone else who can help you?" Preston paused, glancing back at her with an expression that might have been surprise at her concern. "No time to find anyone. They won't last much longer out there." With that, he pushed off again, the raft quickly caught by the current as he began the increasingly dangerous journey back to the remaining 2 men. Natalie watched from the shore, clutching her satchel to her chest, whispering prayers with each breath. Around her, the townspeople who had gathered offered similar prayers and words of encouragement, though none seemed willing to join the rescue effort themselves. "That's Preston for you," said a voice beside her. Natalie turned to find a woman in her 50s standing there, worry creasing her face. "Always putting himself in harm's way for others." "Does he do this often?" Natalie asked, her eyes never leaving the small raft now barely visible in the fading light. "Not flood rescues specifically," the woman replied, "but helping folks in need. That's just who he is." As they watched, Preston reached the island once more. The water had risen so high that it now covered most of the ground where they had been standing. The elderly man and the ranch hand were up to their knees in the flood. Even from this distance, Natalie could see that something was wrong. There appeared to be an argument, gestures made, heads shaking. Finally, the ranch hand helped the elderly man onto the raft, but instead of joining them, he pushed the raft away and remained on the rapidly disappearing island. "What's he doing?" someone gasped. "Too much weight," another voice answered grimly. "Raft won't hold 3 grown men in this current." Natalie's heart clenched as she realized the ranch hand had sacrificed his place, betting that Preston could return one more time before the island disappeared completely. The journey back seemed to take an eternity. Twice the raft nearly overturned and at one point disappeared entirely from view behind a wall of water, causing cries of alarm from the onlookers. But then it reappeared still upright, still moving toward safety. When Preston and the elderly man finally reached shore, cheers erupted from the gathered crowd. But Preston didn't pause to acknowledge them. He was already turning the raft around, his face set in grim determination. "Preston, no," someone called out. The light's almost gone and the water's still rising. He ignored the warning, pushing off once more into the dangerous waters. Natalie watched, heart pounding as the raft grew smaller and smaller, occasionally disappearing in the troughs between swells. The sun had set by the time Preston reached the island for the final time. In the gathering darkness, they could barely make out what was happening, but it appeared the ranch hand was now standing in water up to his waist. Long minutes passed with the raft out of sight in the darkness. The crowd on the shore had grown, lanterns now lit and held aloft in an attempt to provide some guidance to the men fighting for their lives in the flood. "There!" someone finally shouted, pointing to a dark shape moving against the current. The raft emerged from the darkness, but even from a distance they could tell it was in trouble. It moved erratically, spinning more than progressing, and appeared to be riding dangerously low in the water. "They're not going to make it," a man nearby muttered. Natalie refused to believe it. "They will," she insisted, her eyes straining to see through the darkness. "They must." The last 100 yards seemed to take an eternity. Several times the raft disappeared from view entirely, only to reappear farther downstream, clearly being swept away by the current. Each time, somehow, Preston managed to regain some control, fighting to bring them closer to safety. When they were within 50 yards of shore, disaster struck. The raft hit something submerged and broke apart, plunging both men into the raging flood. Cries of alarm rose from the shore as the 2 dark shapes disappeared beneath the water. Natalie found herself wading into the shallows, heedless of the danger, her eyes desperately searching the churning waters. "There!" someone shouted, and a lantern beam illuminated Preston's head breaking the surface, one arm locked around the ranch hand's chest, the other fighting against the current. Men rushed into the water, forming a human chain to reach the struggling pair. Natalie watched, hardly daring to breathe as they were finally pulled from the flood and dragged to shore. The ranch hand was unconscious but breathing. Preston, however, remained on his feet though he was clearly exhausted, his clothes torn, a gash across his forehead streaming blood down his face. "Someone get Doc Miller," a voice called out, and figures hurried away into the night. Natalie found herself moving toward Preston, pulling off her shawl, miraculously still relatively dry inside her satchel, and offering it to him to stanch the bleeding. "You're hurt," she said softly. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, not just as one of the people he had rescued, but as an individual. He accepted the shawl with a nod of thanks, pressing it to his forehead. "You're the woman from Philadelphia," he said, his voice rough from exertion. "With the property on Silver Creek Road." Natalie blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Small town. News travels." He swayed slightly, and Natalie instinctively reached out to steady him, her hand on his arm. "You need to sit down before you fall down, Mr. Irwin," she said firmly. "Preston," he corrected, allowing her to guide him to a nearby wagon bed where he could rest. "Natalie," she offered in return. "Natalie Armstrong." As the town doctor arrived to tend to the injured, and the rescued travelers were led away to find warm food and dry clothes, Natalie found herself lingering beside the man who had risked his life repeatedly to save strangers. There was something about his quiet strength, his unflinching courage, that drew her to him in a way she couldn't quite explain. What she didn't know then, as she sat beside him in the lantern light while the doctor stitched his wound, was that this flood had changed the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. The waters that had threatened to take everything from her had, instead, delivered something unexpected. A chance meeting with a man unlike any she had ever known. And as the night deepened around them, the roar of Silver Creek still audible in the distance, the first tendrils of something that might one day be called love began to take root in ground made fertile by courage and gratitude. The days following the flood were a flurry of activity in Loveland. Townspeople worked tirelessly to repair damaged buildings, clear debris, and help those who had lost homes and livelihoods to the rushing waters. Natalie, having finally reached her destination after the harrowing experience, found herself quickly integrated into these community efforts. Her inherited property, a modest house with a small attached shop on Silver Creek Road, had fortunately been spared the worst of the flooding. The previous owner, her mother's cousin Eliza, had chosen the location wisely, building on a slight rise that kept the foundations dry even as the waters rose. Still, the yard was littered with debris, the fence damaged, and the small garden destroyed. On her third day in Loveland, as she struggled to clear a fallen branch from what remained of the front gate, a familiar figure appeared on the road. Preston Irwin sat tall in the saddle of a chestnut stallion, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning sky. A bandage still covered the gash on his forehead, but otherwise he showed few signs of his ordeal. Beside him, 3 ranch hands led wagons loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies. "Miss Armstrong," he called, dismounting with an easy grace that belied his size. "Thought you might need some help getting your place in order." Natalie straightened, brushing dirt from her hands onto her apron. "Mr. Irwin, this is unexpected." "Preston," he corrected again, a flicker of something that might have been amusement crossing his features. "And it shouldn't be unexpected. Folks help each other out here, especially after something like this." "I can't possibly accept," she began, but he cut her off with a shake of his head. "You're not accepting anything. You're participating in how things work in Loveland. Today we help you, tomorrow you help someone else." He gestured to the wagons now pulling into her yard. "Besides, my men were getting soft at the ranch. Need to keep them busy." The men in question, a weathered older man introduced as Hank, a freckle-faced youth named Billy, and a quiet, broad-shouldered fellow called Reeves, tipped their hats to Natalie, before immediately setting to work assessing the damage to her property. "I insist on providing lunch at least," Natalie said, finding herself smiling despite her initial resistance. There was something disarming about Preston's matter-of-fact approach. "Wouldn't turn that down," he replied, removing his coat and rolling up his sleeves. "Now about that fence." By midday, the transformation was remarkable. The debris had been cleared away, the fence mended, and the men were working on reinforcing the creek bank at the rear of her property to prevent future flooding. Preston worked alongside his men, showing no indication that he considered himself above manual labor despite being their employer. Natalie observed him as she prepared a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and the stew she had made the previous evening. He moved with purpose and efficiency, his instructions to the others clear and direct but never harsh. Occasionally, laughter would rise from the group, a sign that despite the hard work, there was camaraderie among them. When she called them to eat, the men washed up at the pump and settled gratefully around the table she had set up in the yard, the spring day being too fine to eat indoors. The conversation flowed easily, with the ranch hands sharing stories of life in Colorado territory that both entertained and informed Natalie about her new home. "Miss Armstrong was telling me she plans to open a bookshop," Preston mentioned during a lull in the conversation. "Said her cousin left her not just the property but a whole library of books to start with." Natalie looked at him in surprise. She hadn't remembered sharing those details during their brief interactions. Reading her expression, he added, "You mentioned it to Mrs. Holloway while she was patching up my head. I was nearby." "A bookshop." Hank scratched his beard thoughtfully. "That'd be something. Closest one now is all the way in Denver." "Do you think it would do well here?" Natalie asked, genuinely interested in their opinion. Her plan had been formulated back in Philadelphia, without much knowledge of what Loveland might truly need. "Town's growing," Preston said, helping himself to more stew. "Railroads coming through next year. More families settling, which means more children needing school books. And plenty of folks out here are hungry for news and stories from back east." "My Ellie would love a place to find new books," Reeves spoke up, surprising Natalie as it was the first time she'd heard him say more than 2 words together. "She reads everything she can get her hands on, then reads it again because there's nothing new." "Well, then," Natalie said, feeling a growing confidence in her plans, "I'll have to make sure I stock plenty of novels for Ellie." The conversation continued, with each man offering suggestions for what types of books might sell well. Natalie found herself taking mental notes, appreciating this unexpected market research from people who understood the community far better than she did. As the meal concluded and the men prepared to return to work, Preston lingered at the table while the others went ahead. "Thank you," Natalie said, gathering plates. "Not just for the help today, but for everything. I never properly thanked you for saving my life." Preston looked slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," she pointed out gently. "You did. And from what I've heard in town, that's rather in character for you." A flush of color touched his tan cheeks. "People talk too much in small towns." "They do," Natalie agreed with a smile. "But in this case, they speak highly of you. It seems you've earned quite a reputation for integrity and helping others." Preston stood, clearly ready to end this line of conversation. "Speaking of helping, we should get back to work if we want to finish before sundown." The remainder of the afternoon passed quickly, with Preston and his men completing repairs that would have taken Natalie weeks on her own. As the sun began its descent, they loaded their tools back into the wagons and prepared to depart. "I can't thank you enough," Natalie said, standing at her now repaired gate as Preston mounted his horse. "Like I said, It's how things work here. He settled into the saddle, looking down at her with those striking blue eyes. But if you're determined to show gratitude, I hear there's a town social this Saturday at the church. They're raising money to help folks who lost everything in the flood. Are you asking me to attend with you, Mr. Irwin? Natalie asked, a teasing note in her voice. Preston, he reminded her with what might have been the beginning of a smile. And no, I'm merely informing you of a community event, though I will be there and I do enjoy a good pie auction. With that cryptic statement, he tipped his hat and rode away, the wagons following in his wake, leaving Natalie standing at her gate with a smile on her face and a lightness in her heart that had been absent for longer than she cared to admit. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Natalie threw herself into preparations for opening her bookshop. The front room of the house had clearly been designed for commercial use, with large windows facing the street and built-in shelves along the walls. Her cousin Eliza, a lifelong book collector, had indeed left behind a substantial library that formed the foundation of Natalie's inventory. As she sorted and cataloged the books, arranging them by subject and author, Natalie found herself frequently thinking of Preston. There was something compelling about the taciturn rancher, with his quiet strength and unexpected acts of kindness. More than once, she caught herself pausing in her work, a book forgotten in her hands as she recalled the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he almost smiled, or the surprising gentleness of his hands as he had steadied her off the raft. By Saturday, the bookshop was taking shape, though not yet ready to open. Natalie took particular care with her appearance for the church social, selecting a blue dress that her mother had always said brought out the color in her eyes, and arranging her chestnut hair in a style that was neat, but not too formal for a country gathering. The social was held in the churchyard, with tables arranged beneath old oak trees and colorful bunting strung between branches. It seemed the entire population of Loveland and the surrounding area had turned out, creating a lively atmosphere despite the recent hardships many had endured. Natalie was warmly welcomed, with many people expressing interest in her bookshop and sharing their own suggestions for books they hoped she would stock. She found herself introduced to so many people that the names and faces soon became a blur, though everyone was unfailingly kind. She had been at the social for nearly an hour before she spotted Preston. He stood with a group of men near the far edge of the gathering, deep in conversation. Even in this social setting, he maintained an air of quiet authority, his tall frame and broad shoulders making him stand out among the others. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyes finding hers across the crowded yard. He gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement before returning to his conversation. "I see you've caught the eye of Preston Irwin," said a voice beside her. Natalie turned to find a woman about her own age smiling at her. "I'm Rebecca Turner. My husband, Thomas, is the town doctor." "Natalie Armstrong," she replied, shaking the woman's offered hand. "And I'm not sure what you mean about catching anyone's eye. Mr. Irwin merely helped repair some flood damage at my property." Rebecca's smile widened. "Preston Irwin doesn't merely help anyone. He's the most private, self-contained man in 3 counties. The fact that he personally brought his men to assist you has set every tongue in town wagging." Natalie felt a flush rising in her cheeks. "I'm sure it was only because of the circumstances of our meeting." "He did save my life during the flood." "Precisely," Rebecca said, as if Natalie had made her point for her. "Preston's a good man who would help anyone in danger, but he usually disappears back to his ranch once the crisis is over. He doesn't typically follow up with social calls or home repairs." Before Natalie could formulate a response, the minister called for attention, announcing the start of the pie auction that would raise funds for flood relief. "Oh, you must participate," Rebecca said enthusiastically. "It's great fun and for a good cause. Participate." "But I haven't brought a pie," Natalie protested. Rebecca laughed. "Not as a baker, as a bidder. The ladies have all baked pies and the men bid on them. The highest bidder wins both the pie and the company of the baker while eating it." Natalie's eyes widened. "That sounds rather forward." "It's all in good fun and completely proper with everyone watching," Rebecca assured her. "Besides, it's tradition, and the flood victims need all the help we can give." The auction began with great enthusiasm, with the minister serving as auctioneer. One by one, pies were presented and bid upon, often accompanied by good-natured teasing and competitive bidding between young men vying for the attention of specific young ladies. "Next up," the minister announced, "a peach pie baked by Miss Natalie Armstrong, our newest resident who plans to open a bookshop on Silver Creek Road." Natalie gasped in surprise as Rebecca gently pushed her forward. "But I didn't," she began to protest. "I added your name to the list," Rebecca whispered. "Don't worry, that's my pie. I baked extra. Just go along with it, it's for charity." Finding herself suddenly the center of attention, Natalie had little choice but to smile and stand beside the pie in question, a beautiful creation with an intricately latticed crust. "We'll start the bidding at 50 cents, the minister called out. 50 cents, called a young man Natalie didn't recognize. 75, countered another. The bidding quickly escalated, reaching $2, a substantial amount for a pie, even for charity. Natalie stood awkwardly, not sure where to look as men she had just met competed for her company. $3, came a deep voice from the back of the crowd. A murmur ran through the gathering as Preston Irwin stepped forward, his expression unreadable. The previous bidders exchanged glances, seemingly unwilling to challenge him. $3 going once, the minister called. Going twice. $3.50, came a new voice belonging to a well-dressed man with a carefully waxed mustache whom Natalie hadn't noticed before. Harold Blackwood, Rebecca whispered to her, owns the largest general store in town. Widower. Quite the catch, according to the local matchmakers. $4, Preston countered immediately, his eyes never leaving Natalie's face. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. $4 was an unprecedented amount for a charity pie. $5, Blackwood responded, a confident smile on his face. A hush fell over the gathering. $5 was more than some men earned in a week. $10, Preston said quietly, but in the silence everyone heard him clearly. Gasps and whispers erupted. Blackwood's smile faltered, then returned with a tight quality to it. "My friend, you must really want that pie, I concede." $10 going once, the minister said, his own surprise evident in his voice. Going twice, sold to Preston Irwin for $10. Applause broke out as Preston came forward to claim the pie and pay the minister. Natalie stood frozen, her cheeks burning, unsure of what had just transpired or what was expected of her now. "I believe tradition dictates we share this," Preston said as he reached her, the pie in his hands. "Yes, I suppose it does," Natalie managed to reply, acutely aware of the many eyes watching them. "There's a quiet spot under the oak tree over there," he suggested, nodding toward a somewhat secluded corner of the churchyard. "Unless you'd prefer to stay in the thick of things." "The oak tree sounds perfect," she said, grateful for the suggestion of a bit of privacy away from the curious stares. As they walked together toward the tree, Natalie was intensely conscious of Preston beside her, of the subtle scent of leather and pine that seemed to accompany him, of the way he shortened his stride to match hers without appearing to think about it. "I should tell you," she said as they reached the relative seclusion of the oak, "I didn't actually bake that pie. Rebecca Turner did. She put my name on the list without telling me." Preston's lips quirked in what was almost a smile. "I figured as much. You've been busy setting up your shop, not baking." Natalie blinked in surprise. "How did you know I've been working on the shop?" "Small town," he reminded her, setting the pie down on a nearby bench and producing a pocket knife to cut it. "Also, I rode past yesterday and saw you through the window arranging books." The thought that he had ridden past specifically to see her, that he had noticed what she was doing, sent an unexpected warmth through Natalie's chest. "Well, in any case, thank you for the rather extravagant bid," she said. "The flood relief fund will certainly benefit." Preston carefully cut 2 slices of pie and handed one to Natalie on a small plate that had been provided with the pie. "It's a good cause," he said simply. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, enjoying the pie, which was indeed delicious. Around them the social continued, but in their corner under the oak there was a pocket of tranquility. "Your shop," Preston said finally. "When do you plan to open?" "Next week, if all goes well," Natalie replied. "I still need to finish organizing the inventory and set up the accounting books, but the space is nearly ready." "Do you have experience running a business?" "My father was a bookseller in Philadelphia," she explained. "I grew up in his shop and helped manage it after he became ill. After he passed, well, circumstances changed, and when I learned cousin Eliza had left me her property here, it seemed like the right time for a fresh start." Preston nodded, seeming to understand there was more to the story but not pressing for details. Loveland could use a good bookshop, especially with more families moving in as the railroad expands. "That's my hope," Natalie said. "Books were my escape as a child, my education as a young woman, and my livelihood as an adult. I'd like to bring that opportunity to others." "Noble ambition," Preston commented, finishing his slice of pie. "And you?" Natalie asked, suddenly curious about the quiet man who had paid $10 for her company. "What brought you to Colorado Territory?" For a moment she thought he might not answer. His eyes seemed to look beyond her to something distant and perhaps painful. "The war," he said finally. "After Gettysburg, I couldn't go back to Virginia. Too many ghosts. Came west in '65, worked cattle drives until I saved enough to buy land. Started small, built up the ranch year by year." "The Triple P Ranch," Natalie recalled. "What do the PTKs stand for?" A genuine smile flickered across his face, transforming his features. "Preston's persistent pursuit. At least, that's what the previous owner called it when I kept coming back with offers until he finally sold to me." Natalie laughed, delighted by this glimpse of humor. "It suits you." "Persistence seems to be a defining trait." "Some call it stubbornness," he admitted. "Often the same quality, just seen from different perspectives," she replied. Their conversation continued. Moving from the ranch to books, Preston had read more than Natalie would have guessed for a rancher, to the challenges and rewards of life in the West. As they talked, Natalie found herself increasingly drawn to this complex man who spoke little but said much in the words he chose, whose outward strength was matched by an inner thoughtfulness that surprised and intrigued her. The afternoon light had begun to fade when Rebecca Turner approached their secluded spot, looking slightly apologetic for the interruption. "Natalie, several of us are gathering at my home for tea tomorrow after church," she said. "We'd love for you to join us. It would be a good opportunity to meet more of the ladies in town." "That sounds wonderful," Natalie replied sincerely. "Thank you for the invitation." After Rebecca had moved away, Natalie turned back to Preston. "I should probably rejoin the social. I've monopolized your time long enough." "I paid $10 for the privilege," he reminded her, that almost smile appearing again. "But yes, I'm sure others want to meet our new bookseller." As they walked back toward the main gathering, Preston asked quietly, "Will you be attending church tomorrow?" "Yes," Natalie said. "I've always found comfort in Sunday services, especially when everything else in life seems uncertain." Preston nodded. "Perhaps I'll see you there then." "You attend regularly?" she asked, somehow suspecting he wasn't a frequent churchgoer. "Not as often as my mother would have liked," he admitted, "but I find myself with reason to reconsider that habit." Before Natalie could explore what he meant by that cryptic statement, they had rejoined the crowd, and Preston was immediately approached by several ranchers with questions about cattle prices and grazing rights. With a tip of his hat to Natalie, he was drawn into their conversation, leaving her with the lingering impression of blue eyes and an almost smile that she couldn't quite forget. As Natalie mingled with other townspeople for the remainder of the social, she found her thoughts repeatedly returning to the quiet rancher who had bid $10 for her company. There was something about Preston Irwin that intrigued her, a depth beneath his taciturn exterior that she sensed few people took the time to discover. When she finally made her way home in the fading light, guided by a lantern provided by the kind minister's wife, Natalie found herself looking forward to tomorrow's church service with an anticipation that had little to do with spiritual nourishment and everything to do with the possibility of seeing Preston again. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that seemed designed to lift spirits and renew hope. Natalie dressed with particular care in a pale green dress that complemented her chestnut hair, which she arranged in a simple but elegant style beneath a modest bonnet. The small church was nearly full when she arrived, with families and individuals from town, and the surrounding area gathered for the weekly service. Natalie slipped into an available space on a pew near the back, nodding politely to those nearby. She had almost given up hope of seeing Preston when she sensed rather than saw someone enter just as the opening hymn began. Glancing back, she found him standing at the very rear of the church, hat in hand, his dark hair neatly combed, wearing a clean shirt and what appeared to be his best coat. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her the slightest nod before focusing his attention on the minister. The service proceeded with familiar rhythms that Natalie found comforting, hymns she had known since childhood, prayers that echoed those she had heard in Philadelphia, scripture readings that remained unchanged despite the vastly different surroundings. The minister's sermon focused on community and rebuilding after hardship, clearly referencing the recent flood without dwelling excessively on the devastation it had caused. Throughout the service, Natalie was acutely aware of Preston's presence behind her, though she resisted the urge to turn and look at him again. There was something strangely intimate about sharing this experience with him, about knowing he had come to church perhaps for the first time in a long while, and that she might have been part of his reason for attending. When the final hymn concluded and the congregation began to disperse, Natalie found herself hesitating, adjusting her bonnet ribbons with unnecessary care as she waited to see if Preston would approach her. But when she finally looked toward the back of the church, he was gone, slipping away as quietly as he had arrived. A flash of disappointment went through her, followed immediately by self-admonishment. She hardly knew the man, after all. One rescue and one pleasant conversation at a social didn't constitute any sort of relationship that would warrant expectations. "Natalie." "There you are," Rebecca Turner called, approaching with a warm smile. "Several of us are heading to my home now for tea. You'll join us, won't you?" "Of course," Natalie replied, pushing thoughts of Preston aside. "I'm looking forward to it." Rebecca's home proved to be a charming two-story house near the center of town, filled with comfortable furniture and the evidence of a well-established family life. Natalie was introduced to a half-dozen local women, ranging from young wives to grandmotherly matrons, all curious about the newcomer who planned to open a bookshop. The conversation was lively and informative, with the women providing Natalie with a thorough education on the social landscape of Loveland, who was related to whom, which families had been in the area the longest, which businesses were thriving and which were struggling, and, inevitably, the status of every eligible bachelor within a 20-mile radius. "Harold Blackwood has been widowed for 3 years," explained Mrs. Winters, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. "His store does well enough that he's considered quite a catch. He's been looking for a new wife, but none of the local girls have caught his fancy." "He seemed quite interested in you at the social," added Sarah Mitchell, a young mother bouncing a baby on her knee. "Until Preston Irwin outbid him, that is." Natalie felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Blackwood was merely being charitable, I'm sure." "And Preston?" Rebecca asked with a knowing smile. "Was he being merely charitable as well when he bid $10 for your pie?" All eyes turned to Natalie, clearly expecting some revelation about her relationship with the rancher. "Mr. Irwin has been very kind," she said carefully. "He rescued me during the flood and helped repair some damage to my property. I believe he takes the welfare of the community very seriously. Preston Irwin has never bid on a pie in all the years I've lived here," Mrs. Winters declared. "Not even when Mary Collins, whom everyone thought he might court, baked his favorite apple crumble 3 years running." "Perhaps he simply particularly enjoys peach pie," Natalie suggested lightly, attempting to deflect the conversation. The women exchanged glances that suggested they weren't convinced, but Rebecca mercifully changed the subject to Natalie's plans for the bookshop, which carried the conversation in a new direction. By the time Natalie left Rebecca's home late that afternoon, her head was spinning with information about Loveland and its inhabitants. She had learned that Preston's ranch was one of the largest and most successful in the area, that he employed several local men and was known for fair dealings, that he had never shown particular interest in any of the eligible young women in town, despite being considered one of the most desirable bachelors, and that his appearance at church that morning had been noteworthy enough that several women had commented on it. She had also, somewhat to her surprise, found herself with several new friends. Rebecca had insisted Natalie join her family for dinner the following Sunday. Mrs. Winters had offered to help sort books at the shop whenever Natalie needed an extra pair of hands, and Sarah Mitchell had requested Natalie set aside any children's books she might acquire, as her older children were becoming avid readers. As Natalie walked home in the golden light of late afternoon, she felt a growing sense that Loveland might indeed become the home she had hoped for when she had set out from Philadelphia. The community was welcoming, her business prospects seemed promising, and there was. She stopped that thought before it could fully form. There was no point in dwelling on Preston Irwin and the curious warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. She had come west for a fresh start, to establish herself as an independent businesswoman, not to lose herself in romantic fancies about a man she barely knew. Still, as she rounded the corner onto Silver Creek Road and saw her small house with its soon-to-be bookshop, Natalie couldn't help but glance down the road in the direction of the Triple P Ranch, wondering what Preston might be doing at that moment, and if, perhaps, he might be thinking of her too. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity as Natalie prepared for the bookshop's opening. Mrs. Winters proved true to her word, appearing at Natalie's door on Tuesday morning with her sleeves already rolled up, ready to help organize the remaining books. With her assistance, and that of Rebecca, who stopped by each afternoon, The shop was ready by Friday, shelves neatly arranged, a small reading area set up near the front window, and a proper desk and ledger book established for transactions. Throughout the week, Natalie found herself watching the road more often than she cared to admit, half expecting, half hoping to see Preston riding past. But there was no sign of the taciturn rancher, and she told herself firmly that it was for the best. She needed to focus on establishing her business, not daydreaming about a man who had shown her kindness but had made no declarations or promises. Saturday morning opening day for Armstrong Books dawned bright and clear. Natalie had posted notices around town and placed an advertisement in the weekly newspaper, announcing the shop's opening and listing some of the books available. She had no idea how many people might come, or if anyone would come at all, but she was determined to make the day a success. To her delight, customers began arriving shortly after she unlocked the doors at 9 o'clock. Some came out of curiosity, some to welcome her to the business community, but many came specifically seeking books. The school teacher purchased several educational texts, a young couple bought a book of household management, and several people requested novels that Natalie promised to order from her contacts in Denver and back east. By midday, the small shop was buzzing with activity. Natalie barely had time to eat the sandwich Rebecca had thoughtfully brought her, let alone think about who hadn't come to the opening. She was ringing up a purchase for Mrs. Winters, a volume of poetry that the older woman admitted was a secret indulgence when the shop door opened again. Looking up with a ready smile for the new customer, Natalie felt her heart give an unexpected leap as Preston ducked his tall frame through the doorway. He wore his everyday clothes, clearly having come from the ranch, but had made an effort to brush the dust from his coat and hat before entering. "Mr. Irwin," she greeted him, attempting to keep her voice steady and professional. "Welcome to Armstrong Books. Preston," he corrected automatically, removing his hat as he stepped fully into the shop. His eyes took in the transformed space, lingering on the reading area with its comfortable chair and small table. "You've done well with the place. Looks like a proper bookshop now." "Thank you," Natalie replied, finishing Mrs. Winters' transaction with hands that she hoped didn't visibly tremble. "We've been quite busy this morning." "Word spreads fast," Preston said, moving deeper into the shop to examine the shelves, "especially about something new." Mrs. Winters gathered her purchase with a knowing smile that Natalie pretended not to notice. "I'll let you attend to your customer, dear," the older woman said. "Don't forget about our Ladies' Aid Society meeting on Wednesday. We'd love to have you join us." As Mrs. Winters left, Natalie turned her attention fully to Preston, who was now examining a shelf of history books with apparent interest. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" she asked, coming around the counter to join him. He didn't immediately answer, his fingers tracing the spine of a volume about the Civil War before moving on. "Not exactly," he said finally. "Just wanted to see how your opening was going." "Very well, thank you," she said, oddly touched by his concern. "Better than I expected, actually." Preston nodded, seeming pleased by this information. "Good. Loveland needs a place like this, especially with more families settling all the time." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, Preston continuing to peruse the books while Natalie tried to think of something more to say that wouldn't reveal how often she had thought of him during the past week. "I have some books on ranching and animal husbandry," she offered finally. "Over in the agriculture section. They're a bit outdated, but I've ordered newer editions from Denver." "Might take a look at those," Preston said, following her to a different shelf. As they walked, his hand brushed against hers briefly, an accidental contact that nonetheless sent a jolt of awareness through Natalie. For the next 20 minutes, as other customers came and went, Preston remained in the shop, examining various books, occasionally asking questions about specific titles or authors. Natalie found herself enjoying his company, the quiet way he considered each book, the thoughtful questions he asked. He was clearly more well-read than his rugged exterior might suggest. Finally, he selected 3 books a volume on cattle breeding techniques, a history of the American West, and somewhat to Natalie's surprise, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets. "Diverse interests," she commented as she rang up his purchases. A hint of that almost smile appeared. "Man can't spend all his time thinking about cattle." As she wrapped the books in paper and tied them with string, Natalie found herself reluctant for his visit to end. "I close at 4 today," she said, the words out before she had fully considered them. "I was thinking of taking a walk by the creek afterward. They say it's finally returned to its banks." Preston looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Creek might still be running high in places," he said finally. "Wouldn't be safe to walk alone." Natalie's heart sank slightly at what seemed like a rejection of her implied invitation. "Of course, you're right." "Perhaps another time when I could accompany you," Preston interrupted, his voice gruff. "If you'd like the company." The flutter returned to Natalie's chest. "I would, thank you." "I'll come by at 4 then," he said, gathering his wrapped books and placing his hat back on his head. At the door, he paused and looked back. "Congratulations on the shop, Natalie. You've created something special here." With that, he was gone, leaving Natalie with a smile she couldn't suppress and a fluttering sensation in her stomach that had nothing to do with business success. The remainder of the afternoon passed both too quickly and not quickly enough. Customers continued to come and go, many expressing delight at having a bookshop in town and promising to return. Natalie's ledger showed a respectable number of sales for the first day, and her list of books to order had grown impressively. As 4 o'clock approached, she found herself growing increasingly nervous about her upcoming walk with Preston. It wasn't a proper social call or an official outing, merely a walk to see the creek, but it felt significant nonetheless. She had been in Loveland barely 2 weeks, and already this quiet rancher had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. At precisely 4 o'clock, as Natalie was turning the sign on the door from open to closed, Preston appeared on the street outside. He had clearly gone home and changed, wearing a clean shirt and brushed coat, his dark hair still damp from what must have been a hasty wash. "Right on time," Natalie said, opening the door to him with a smile. "Let me just get my shawl." A few minutes later, they were walking side by side down Silver Creek Road toward the path that led to the creek itself. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dirt road, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh water. "Your shop seemed busy," Preston commented as they walked. "Good first day." "Very good," Natalie confirmed. "I was pleased by how many people came, and more importantly, how many actually purchased books. I was a bit worried that people might come out of curiosity but not buy anything." "Folks around here are practical," Preston said. "They don't spend money unless they see value. The fact that they bought books means they respect what you're offering." They reached the creek path and turned onto it, the terrain becoming slightly more uneven. Without comment, Preston offered his arm to steady Natalie over the rougher ground, and she took it, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath her fingers. The creek came into view as they rounded a bend in the path. It was indeed back within its banks, though still flowing more swiftly than normal. The devastation of the flood was evident in the debris caught in trees and bushes well above the current water level, but already new growth was beginning to emerge from the mud-covered ground. Hard to believe it rose so high, Natalie said softly, remembering the terrifying power of the water that had threatened to sweep her away. Nature's always been more powerful than man, Preston replied, his own gaze on the now placid creek. All we can do is respect it and try to be prepared. They continued walking along the path that paralleled the creek, occasionally stopping to observe a particularly interesting piece of driftwood or a bird building a nest in the trees above. Their conversation flowed easily, moving from the recovery of the town after the flood to books they had both read, to Natalie's life in Philadelphia before coming west. You mentioned circumstances changing after your father died, Preston said as they paused to watch the sunset reflecting on the water. If you don't mind my asking, what brought you all the way to Colorado? Natalie hesitated. She had shared little of her past with anyone in Loveland, preferring to present herself simply as a bookseller's daughter seeking a new start. But something about Preston's direct gaze and genuine interest made her want to be honest with him. After my father died, I was engaged to be married, she began, looking out over the water rather than at him. Thomas Caldwell was a partner in my father's business and the marriage seemed sensible. He would take over the bookshop, I would maintain my connection to it, and we would build a life together. Preston remained silent, waiting for her to continue. 2 weeks before the wedding, I discovered he had been unfaithful, with my cousin no less. The pain had dulled over time, but the humiliation still stung. When confronted, he admitted he had pursued me primarily to gain control of the bookshop, which was more successful than I had realized. The marriage was merely a convenient business arrangement for him. Fool, Preston said quietly, the single word containing a wealth of contempt. Natalie glanced at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. Yes, well, the engagement was broken, of course, but Philadelphia is not so large a city that I could avoid the gossip and pitying looks. When I received word that Cousin Eliza had left me her property here, it seemed like providence, a chance to start fresh where no one knew my history. And now, Preston asked, do you regret coming? Natalie considered the question seriously. No, she said finally, with genuine certainty. I miss certain aspects of city life, and of course I miss my friends. But there's something real about Loveland. The people, the land, even the challenges. It feels more authentic than the society I left behind. Preston nodded as if her answer satisfied something important to him. They resumed walking, the path now leading away from the creek and back toward town as the light began to fade from the sky. What about you? Natalie asked. You mentioned coming west after Gettysburg. Have you ever thought of returning east? A shadow crossed Preston's face. Nothing for me there. My family's farm was in northern Virginia. Parents died before the war. 2 younger brothers died at Bull Run. The farm would have been confiscated anyway, being on the wrong side. Natalie's heart ached at the matter-of-fact way he recounted the loss of his entire family. I'm sorry, she said softly. That's a heavy burden to bear. Preston shrugged, but she sensed the casualness was a carefully constructed facade. Many lost more. At least I had the chance to build something new out here. Not everyone got that opportunity. They walked in silence for a few minutes, Natalie acutely aware of the depth of character in the man beside her. He had faced devastation and loss, yet had found the strength to create a new life, to build something meaningful from nothing. It was a resilience she admired deeply. As they neared the edge of town, the path widening back into Silver Creek Road, Preston spoke again. Tomorrow's Sunday. Yes, Natalie agreed, unsure where he was going with the observation. I'll be at church, he said, his eyes fixed ahead. Thought I might walk you to Rebecca Turner's afterward, if you're still planning to have dinner with them. Natalie couldn't suppress the smile that spread across her face. "I am, and I would appreciate the escort, thank you." They had reached her gate now, the lamps in her front windows casting a warm glow into the gathering dusk. Preston stopped, turning to face her fully for the first time since they had left the creek. "Thank you for the walk," he said formally, though there was a warmth in his eyes that belied the stiffness of his words. "And for sharing your story." "Thank you for listening," Natalie replied, "and for showing me that the creek can be beautiful as well as dangerous." For a moment, they stood in silence, the air between them charged with something unspoken but increasingly undeniable. Then Preston took a small step back, tipping his hat slightly. "Until tomorrow, then," he said. "Until tomorrow," Natalie echoed, watching as he turned and walked away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the evening shadows. As she entered her home, lighting additional lamps and preparing her simple dinner, Natalie found herself humming a tune she couldn't quite place. There was a lightness in her heart that had been absent for too long, a sense of possibility that extended beyond the success of her bookshop, to encompass the unexpected connection she was forming with a quiet rancher who had risked his life to save her. Sunday morning brought clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect weather for the spring day. Natalie dressed with particular care in a lavender dress she had not yet worn in Loveland, arranging her hair in a style slightly more elaborate than her usual practical bun. She told herself it was simply appropriate to look her best for church and dinner with the Turners, but she couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation she felt at the thought of seeing Preston again. When she arrived at the church, she immediately spotted him standing near the entrance, hat in hand, clearly watching for her. Something warm unfurled in her chest at the realization that he had been waiting specifically for her arrival. "Good morning," she greeted him, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "Morning," he replied, that almost smile briefly appearing. "You look nice." "Thank you," Natalie said, touched by the simple compliment that she suspected didn't come easily to him. They entered the church together, causing a few heads to turn and whispers to circulate. Preston seemed oblivious to the attention, guiding Natalie to a pew with a light touch at her elbow that sent a disproportionate thrill through her. Throughout the service, Natalie was acutely aware of Preston beside her, the subtle scent of soap and clean linen, the way his large frame made the church pew seem smaller, the deep resonance of his voice during the hymns. Once, when they both reached for the hymnal at the same moment, their hands brushed, and the brief contact left her fingers tingling. After the service, as the congregation dispersed, several people approached Natalie to compliment her on the bookshop or inquire about specific titles. Preston remained quietly at her side, nodding acknowledgments to those who greeted him but otherwise content to wait while she conducted her informal business discussions. "Word has certainly spread about your shop," he commented as they finally began walking toward the Turners' home. "Seems like half the town wants to talk to you about books." "It's encouraging," Natalie agreed, "though I hope I can fulfill all the requests. My suppliers in Denver and back east might be overwhelmed by my first order." "If you need anything transported from Denver, my men make the journey regularly for ranch supplies," Preston offered. "Would be no trouble to pick up a crate of books while they're there." "That's very kind," Natalie said, touched by the practical offer of assistance. "I might take you up on that." They walked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the spring day warm around them. Natalie found herself wanting to prolong this simple pleasure of walking beside Preston through the town, enjoying the clarity of the mountain air and the subtle sense of connection growing between them. "I've been thinking," Preston said suddenly, breaking the silence. "There's to be a dance next Saturday at the community hall. celebrating the completion of repairs after the flood. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Would you consider attending with me?" The direct invitation, so different from his oblique suggestion about the pie social, took Natalie by surprise. A warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine spread through her. "I would be delighted," she answered, her voice steadier than the fluttering in her chest would suggest. Preston's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if he had been genuinely uncertain of her response. "Good," he said simply. "I'll call for you at 7. They had reached the Turners' home, where Rebecca was already waiting at the door with a knowing smile. "Right on time," she called out. "Dinner's nearly ready." Preston tipped his hat to both women. "I'll leave you to your dinner then. Good day, Mrs. Turner. Natalie." The use of her given name, spoken with a quiet intimacy that seemed meant for her ears alone, sent another wave of warmth through Natalie. "Good day, Preston," she replied softly. As he walked away, Rebecca linked her arm through Natalie's and led her inside. "Well," she said, her smile widening, "it seems our new bookseller has made quite an impression on Preston Irwin." Natalie felt a blush rising in her cheeks but couldn't suppress her own smile. "He's asked me to the dance on Saturday," she admitted. Rebecca's eyes widened. "Has he indeed? Preston Irwin hasn't attended a dance in all the years I've lived in Loveland, let alone escorted a lady to one." "You must tell me everything, but first, let's join Thomas and the children for dinner. You can be sure I'll extract every detail afterward." The week leading up to the dance passed in a pleasant blur of activity. The bookshop continued to draw customers, with word spreading beyond Loveland to neighboring communities. Natalie found herself busy from opening until closing most days, creating orders for requested books, organizing the growing collection, and getting to know the townspeople through their literary preferences. Preston didn't visit the shop again that week, but Natalie understood he was likely busy with spring ranch work. She heard from various customers that calving season was in full swing at the Triple P, with Preston and his men working long hours to ensure the health of the new additions to his herd. By Saturday, Natalie had worked herself into a state of nervous anticipation about the dance. She had brought only one truly formal dress from Philadelphia, a deep blue silk with modest lace trim that had been made for her canceled wedding festivities, and never worn. After much deliberation, she decided to wear it, telling herself it was practical to make use of the finest dress she owned rather than any symbolic reclaiming of what had been meant for another occasion entirely. As the hour approached, she pinned her hair in an elegant style she hadn't attempted since leaving Philadelphia, allowing a few soft curls to frame her face. A touch of her mother's perfume at her wrists and throat completed her preparations. At precisely 7 o'clock, a knock came at her door. Taking a deep breath to steady her inexplicably racing heart, Natalie opened it to find Preston standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking more formal than she had ever seen him. He wore a well-tailored dark suit, a crisp white shirt, and a neatly knotted tie. His dark hair was carefully combed, his face freshly shaved, revealing the clean lines of his jaw and cheekbones that his usual stubble obscured. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, a mutual appreciation reflected in their eyes. "You look beautiful," Preston said finally, the words simple but heartfelt. "Thank you," Natalie replied, a pleased flush warming her cheeks. "You look very handsome yourself." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Hank insisted on pressing my suit. Said he wouldn't have me embarrassing the Triple P by looking like I'd slept in my clothes." Natalie laughed, charmed by this glimpse into his relationship with his men. "I must remember to thank Hank then." Preston offered his arm, and she took it, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath her fingers as she had been during their creek walk. A buggy waited outside, far more elegant than the utilitarian wagons she had seen at her property during the repairs. "You didn't ride?" she asked, surprised. "Didn't think it proper to ask you to ride horseback in your fine dress," Preston replied, helping her into the buggy with careful hands. "Borrowed this from Thomas Turner. He was suspiciously eager to lend it." The drive to the community hall was pleasant, the evening air mild, the sky painted with the spectacular colors of a Colorado sunset. Natalie found conversation with Preston increasingly easy, his initial reserve gradually giving way to a dry humor and thoughtful observations that revealed the intelligent mind behind his quiet exterior. The community hall was transformed for the occasion, decorated with lanterns and spring flowers, a small band set up at one end playing a lively tune. It seemed the entire population of Loveland and the surrounding area had turned out for the celebration, the room already crowded when Preston and Natalie arrived. Their entrance together caused a noticeable ripple of interest through the gathering. Natalie was now familiar enough with local gossip to understand why Preston Irwin, the confirmed bachelor who rarely participated in social events, had not only attended but had brought a lady as his companion. "Quite a turnout," Preston commented, seemingly oblivious to the stir they had caused. "Yes," Natalie agreed, smiling at familiar faces in the crowd. "It's good to see everyone enjoying themselves after the hardships of the flood." They made their way through the room, stopping frequently as people greeted them. Natalie was touched by how many townspeople went out of their way to welcome her, to mention books they had purchased or planned to purchase, to include her in their conversations, as if she had always been part of the community. Throughout it all, Preston remained steadfastly at her side, his quiet presence a reassuring constant. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened, clearly respecting his opinion and judgment. Natalie began to understand that his influence in the community extended far beyond his success as a rancher. He was someone people turned to for guidance and support, a natural leader who never sought the role but accepted its responsibilities without complaint. When the band struck up a waltz, Preston turned to her, a question in his eyes. "Would you care to dance?" he asked formally, though there was an underlying uncertainty in his voice that Natalie found endearing. "I would," she replied, placing her hand in his offered one. Preston led her onto the dance floor, where several couples were already moving to the music. He placed his hand respectfully at her waist, keeping a proper distance between them as they began to move to the rhythm of the waltz. To Natalie's surprise, he was a skilled dancer, guiding her confidently through the steps with a natural grace that belied his rugged appearance. "You dance very well," she commented, looking up into his face. That almost smile appeared. "My mother insisted all her sons learn. Said any true gentleman should be able to waltz without stepping on a lady's toes. Your mother was a wise woman." "She was," Preston agreed, a shadow of old grief briefly crossing his features before he continued more lightly, "though my brothers and I complained bitterly at the time. She made us practice with each other, which led to more than a few scuffles." Natalie laughed at the image of young Preston reluctantly dancing with his brothers. "I'm grateful for her insistence now," she said. "It's a pleasure to dance with someone who knows what they're doing." As the waltz continued, Natalie became increasingly aware of Preston's physical presence, the strength in the arm that guided her, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the subtle scent of soap and leather that seemed uniquely his. They moved together with a natural harmony that felt both surprising and somehow inevitable. As if they had danced together many times before, when the music ended, Preston didn't immediately release her. his blue eyes holding hers for a moment longer than was strictly proper. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the connection that was growing stronger with each shared moment. The spell was broken by Harold Blackwood, who approached with a determined smile. "Miss Armstrong," he said, giving Preston a brief nod that held a hint of challenge. "Might I have the honor of the next dance?" Natalie glanced at Preston, not wanting to leave his company but aware that it would be impolite to refuse. Preston gave her a slight nod, releasing her hand. "I'll fetch us some punch," he said, stepping back to allow Blackwood to claim her for the next dance. Blackwood proved to be an adequate dancer, but lacked Preston's natural grace. He was, however, an enthusiastic conversationalist, filling the dance with questions about Natalie's bookshop, her life in Philadelphia, and her impressions of Loveland. "I hope you're finding our little town welcoming," he said, steering her through a turn with slightly too much force. "It must be quite a change from the sophistication of Philadelphia." "It is different," Natalie acknowledged, "but in the most refreshing ways. The people here are genuine and kind. I've felt welcomed from the start. And your business is doing well. I noticed quite a few customers in your shop this week when I passed by." "Yes, the response has been wonderful. People seem eager to have access to books without traveling to Denver." Blackwood nodded, his expression calculating in a way that reminded Natalie uncomfortably of her former fiancé. "You know, I've been considering expanding my general store. There might be advantages in combining our businesses. The store already sells paper, pens, and stationery. Books would be a natural addition." Natalie stiffened slightly. "I appreciate the suggestion, Mr. Blackwood, but I've only just opened my shop. I'm not looking for any business arrangements at present." Of course," he said smoothly. "Just something to consider for the future." A woman alone in business faces many challenges that a partnership could alleviate. Before Natalie could formulate a response to this thinly veiled suggestion, the dance ended, and she spotted Preston making his way toward them, 2 cups of punch in hand. "Thank you for the dance, Mr. Blackwood," she said, stepping away from him with barely concealed relief. "The pleasure was mine," Blackwood replied, his eyes darting between her and the approaching Preston. "Do consider what I said. We could accomplish much together." With that, he moved away, leaving Natalie with an uneasy feeling that had nothing to do with his dancing abilities and everything to do with the calculating look in his eyes. "Everything all right?" Preston asked as he handed her a cup of punch. "Yes, fine," Natalie said, not wanting to cloud the evening with Blackwood's unwelcome business proposition. "Mr. Blackwood is quite enterprising." Preston's eyes followed Blackwood across the room, a hint of wariness in his gaze. "He is that. Been trying to buy out half the businesses in town since he arrived 3 years ago. Hasn't made him popular with the independent shopkeepers." "I can imagine," Natalie murmured, making a mental note to be cautious in her future dealings with the store owner. The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly, with Natalie dancing several more times with Preston and once each with Thomas Turner, the young minister, and Reeves from the Triple P, who shyly requested a dance at his employer's encouraging nod. Between dances, she and Preston sat together, conversing easily or simply enjoying the festive atmosphere and each other's company. As the celebration began to wind down, Preston suggested they step outside for some fresh air. The night was clear, stars blazing in the black Colorado sky with an intensity Natalie had never seen in Philadelphia. They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, admiring the brilliant display. "I never tire of this view," Preston said quietly. "One of the things that made me decide to stay in Colorado. The sky seems closer out here." It's beautiful, Natalie agreed, as if you could reach up and touch the stars. Another comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the muted sounds of music and laughter from inside the hall. Natalie, Preston began, his voice taking on a serious tone that made her turn to look at him. I'm not a man of many words, never have been, but I want you to know that He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I've enjoyed your company these past few weeks, more than enjoyed it. Natalie's heart quickened at the earnestness in his voice. I've enjoyed yours as well, she said softly. Very much. Preston turned to face her fully, his eyes reflecting the starlight. I'd like to court you properly if you're amenable. I know you came west to establish your independence, and I respect that. Your bookshop is yours, and I'd never presume to interfere with it. But I find myself thinking of you at odd moments during the day, wondering what you're reading, or if you're smiling at something a customer said, or if you might be thinking of me too. The simple honesty of his declaration touched Natalie deeply. There was no flowery language or grand gestures, just the straightforward expression of genuine feeling that she was coming to associate with everything about Preston Irwin. I am, she admitted, her own voice soft but clear in the night air. Thinking of you, that is. More often than I should probably admit. The ghost of a smile that she had come to cherish appeared, more pronounced than she had yet seen it. Then may I have your permission to call on you, not just at social gatherings or church, but properly at your home? Yes, Natalie said, the single word carrying the weight of a decision that felt both momentous and utterly natural. I would like that very much. Preston's smile deepened, transforming his face in a way that made Natalie's breath catch. Slowly, giving her plenty of time to object if she wished, he reached for her hand, his fingers warm and slightly calloused as they enfolded hers. Thank you, he said simply, the two words containing depths of feeling that more elaborate phrases could never have conveyed. They stood there beneath the stars, hands joined, the connection between them deepening with each shared heartbeat. It wasn't a passionate declaration or a dramatic embrace, but in its quiet simplicity, it felt like the beginning of something true and lasting, a foundation being laid with care and honest feeling. When they finally returned to the hall, something had subtly shifted between them. Nothing that would be obvious to casual observers, but to Natalie, it felt as if a door had opened to a future she hadn't known she was seeking until this quiet man had entered her life. As Preston drove her home later that night, the road silver in the moonlight, Natalie felt a contentment that went beyond the success of her shop or her growing acceptance in the community. It was a deeper sense of rightness, of having found a place and a person that matched something essential in herself. At her door, Preston helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering slightly at her waist before he stepped back to a respectful distance. Thank you for a wonderful evening, Natalie said, reluctant for the night to end despite the lateness of the hour. The pleasure was mine, Preston replied, his deep voice soft in the night. May I call on you tomorrow afternoon? Perhaps we could take another walk if the weather holds. I'd like that, Natalie said, smiling up at him. The shop closes at 3 on Sundays. Preston nodded, his eyes holding hers in the dim light from her porch lamp. For a moment she thought he might step forward, might take her hand again or perhaps even kiss her, but instead he simply tipped his hat. Until tomorrow, then, he said. Good night, Natalie. Good night, Preston, she replied, watching as he returned to the buggy and drove away, the sound of hooves and wheels gradually fading into the quiet of the Loveland night. Inside her home, Natalie moved about preparing for bed with a lightness in her heart that felt both new and somehow inevitable. As she brushed out her hair and changed into her nightgown, her thoughts kept returning to the moment outside the dance hall, to Preston's honest declaration and the feeling of his hand holding hers. She had come west seeking independence and a fresh start, never expecting to find herself contemplating a potential courtship barely a month after her arrival. Yet there was nothing rushed or impulsive about her feelings for Preston. Rather, it felt as if she was recognizing something that had been waiting for her all along, a connection that had begun the moment he had appeared on a makeshift raft in floodwaters, risking his life to save strangers. As she drifted towards sleep, Natalie found herself thinking that perhaps the flood that had nearly claimed her life had instead delivered her precisely where she needed to be, to the community that would welcome her, and to the man whose quiet strength and integrity were already becoming essential to her happiness. The following weeks unfolded in a pattern that brought increasing joy to Natalie's life. Her bookshop continued to thrive, with customers now coming from as far as 20 miles away to browse her growing collection. Preston called on her regularly, sometimes for walks along the now peaceful creek, sometimes for quiet evenings on her porch, sometimes to escort her to church or community events. Their courtship progressed with the same honest simplicity that characterized Preston himself. There were no grand gestures or dramatic declarations, just the steady deepening of connection through shared conversations, mutual respect, and the gradual revelation of themselves to each other. Natalie learned that, beneath Preston's taciturn exterior, was a mind that was both thoughtful and surprisingly philosophical. He read widely when time permitted, had a keen interest in the changing politics of the West, and possessed a dry humor that emerged more frequently as he grew comfortable in her presence. Preston, in turn, discovered Natalie's passion for education, her belief in the power of books to transform lives, and her quiet determination to build something meaningful in her new home. He admired her courage in leaving everything familiar behind to start anew in a place where women rarely established independent businesses. By midsummer, their courtship was the subject of good-natured speculation throughout Loveland. Regular customers at the bookshop often casually inquired if Preston had been by recently, while Rebecca Turner made no secret of her delight at having played a small role in bringing them together. "I knew from the moment I saw him bid on your pie that something special was happening," she told Natalie over tea one afternoon in late July. "Preston Irwin has never shown such interest in any woman since coming to Loveland. Many have tried to catch his attention over the years, but he remained steadfastly uninterested until you arrived." "Perhaps it was just a matter of timing," Natalie suggested, though she couldn't help the pleased flush that rose to her cheeks. Rebecca laughed, shaking her head. "It was a matter of the right woman finally appearing. Anyone who sees the two of you together can tell there's something rare between you, the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching." She sighed romantically. "Thomas says he's never seen Preston so content." The conversation left Natalie thoughtful. She knew her feelings for Preston had grown significantly over the past months. What had begun as admiration and attraction had deepened into something she was beginning to recognize as love. But they had not yet spoken those words to each other, maintaining a careful restraint in both word and deed that sometimes tested her patience while simultaneously increasing her respect for him. That evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Natalie found herself studying Preston's profile, admiring the strong lines of his face and the quiet confidence he exuded even in repose. "Rebecca says the whole town is speculating about us," she said lightly, breaking the comfortable silence. Preston turned to look at her, that almost smile playing around his lips. "Small towns always need something to talk about. And does it bother you, being the subject of gossip? He considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "No," he said finally. "Though I worry it might bother you, you came here for a fresh start, not to be the center of attention." "I don't mind," Natalie assured him. "It's different from the gossip in Philadelphia. There's no malice in it here, just genuine interest and, I think, goodwill." Preston nodded, his eyes returning to the sunset. "People care about each other here. Sometimes that means they involve themselves in matters that might be considered private elsewhere. But there's value in being part of a community that notices if you're struggling or celebrates when you're doing well." "I've come to appreciate that," Natalie agreed. "In Philadelphia, I knew my immediate neighbors, but there wasn't the same sense of interconnection. Here, everyone seems genuinely invested in each other's welfare." "It's one of the things that kept me in Loveland when I could have moved on," Preston admitted. "That and the land itself. There's something about these mountains, this valley." He gestured toward the distant peaks now gilded with the last light of day. "Feels like home in a way Virginia never did, even before the war." Natalie's heart warmed at this glimpse into his attachment to the place that was becoming increasingly precious to her as well. "I understand," she said softly. "I've only been here a few months, but already it feels more like home than Philadelphia did in recent years." They sat in companionable silence as the colors faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear. In the distance, a coyote called, the sound echoing across the valley. "Natalie," Preston said finally, his voice taking on a serious tone that immediately drew her full attention. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you." Her heart quickened, though she tried to keep her expression composed. "Yes." Preston shifted to face her more directly, his blue eyes intent in the gathering dusk. "I've been thinking about the future, about what I want for my life, for the ranch, for—" He paused, then continued more firmly. "For us, if there could be in us beyond what we have now." "I've been thinking about that too," Natalie admitted softly. Preston's expression lightened slightly at her words. "Have you?" When she nodded, he continued, "I want to be clear about something first. Your bookshop is yours. I would never ask you to give it up or change how you run it. It's important to me that you know that." "Thank you," Natalie said, touched by his explicit acknowledgement of her independence. "That means a great deal to me." "That said," Preston continued, reaching for her hand, which she willingly gave him, "I find myself unable to imagine a future that doesn't include you, Natalie. These past months have been the happiest I can remember. You've brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing until I found it." Natalie's heart seemed to swell within her chest, making it difficult to breathe. "Preston, please," he said gently, "let me finish while I have the courage. I'm not a man who finds words easy, especially when it comes to feelings." He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I love you, Natalie Armstrong. I love your courage, your intelligence, your kindness. I love the way you've embraced this community and the life you're building here. And if you could see your way to considering a future with me, I would count myself the most fortunate of men." Tears sprang to Natalie's eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming joy. "I love you too," she whispered, the words she had held back for weeks finally finding voice. "So much." Preston's face transformed with a genuine, full smile, the first she had ever seen from him. It lit his features in a way that made him appear younger, almost boyish in his happiness. Without releasing her hand, he reached into his pocket with his free hand and withdrew a small object. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer," he said, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "I know it's been less than 6 months since you arrived in Loveland. But I wanted you to know my intentions, to understand that what I feel for you isn't fleeting or casual." Natalie looked at the ring, then back at Preston's face, her heart so full she could barely contain the emotion. "It hasn't been long in terms of time," she said thoughtfully, "but in terms of knowing my own heart and mind, I've never been more certain of anything." Hope blazed in Preston's eyes. "Does that mean—" "It means yes," Natalie said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Preston Irwin. I can imagine no greater happiness than building a life with you." For a moment, Preston seemed stunned, as if he had prepared himself for a request to wait, to give her more time. Then, with gentle reverence, he slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if it had been made for her. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "The one thing I kept when I left Virginia. Somehow, I always knew it would matter someday." Natalie looked down at the ring, now hers, a symbol of not just their future together but a connection to Preston's past, to the family he had lost. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll treasure it always." Preston raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles just above the ring. The tender gesture, so unlike his usual restraint, made Natalie's heart race. When he looked up, his eyes held a question and an invitation. With a courage born of certainty, Natalie leaned forward slightly, her free hand coming to rest against his chest. Understanding her silent permission, Preston closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a first kiss that was gentle yet filled with the promise of all they would become to each other. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers, their hands still linked between them. "I never expected this," he confessed quietly. "When I built that raft during the flood, I was just doing what needed to be done. I had no idea I was actually heading toward the rest of my life." Natalie smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness. "Sometimes the most important journeys begin with a simple act of courage," she said. "I'm just grateful the flood brought me to you, even if it was a rather dramatic introduction." Preston's answering smile was all she needed to know that whatever challenges might lie ahead, they would face them together, the bookseller who had sought a new beginning and the rancher who had built a raft and found his future. The news of their engagement spread through Loveland with remarkable speed, generating a wave of goodwill and congratulations. Rebecca Turner was among the first to express her delight, arriving at the bookshop the very next morning with flowers and enthusiastic plans for a celebration dinner. "I knew it," she exclaimed, embracing Natalie warmly. "From the moment he bid on your pie, I told Thomas something special was happening. Oh, I'm so happy for you both." The following Sunday, after church, the minister made a formal announcement of their engagement to the congregation, resulting in a spontaneous round of applause and many handshakes for Preston and embraces for Natalie. The genuine pleasure the community took in their happiness touched Natalie deeply, reinforcing her growing love for Loveland and its people. Only Harold Blackwood's congratulations seemed less than wholehearted, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he offered Preston a stiff handshake and Natalie a formal bow. "I wish you both great happiness," he said, though his tone suggested disappointment rather than good wishes. "Miss Armstrong, should you reconsider your business arrangements at any point, my offer remains open." Preston's expression darkened slightly at this, but Natalie squeezed his arm reassuringly. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, but I'm quite content with my current arrangements. The bookshop will continue as it is." As summer progressed into early autumn, Natalie and Preston began making plans for their shared future. The question of where they would live after marriage required careful consideration. Preston's ranch house, while spacious by frontier standards, was several miles from town, which would make running the bookshop difficult for Natalie. "I could build an addition to your house," Preston suggested one evening as they discussed the matter. Make it large enough for both of us, while keeping the shop intact. Natalie considered this, appreciating his willingness to adapt to her needs rather than simply expecting her to move to the ranch. That might work, she agreed. Though I worry about intruding on your work at the ranch if you're living in town. I spend most days there anyway, Preston pointed out, and Hank is more than capable of overseeing things when I'm not present. Been doing it for years when I have business elsewhere. After much discussion, they settled on a compromise that seemed to address both their needs. They would maintain Natalie's house in town, expanding it to accommodate their married life while preserving the bookshop, and would also keep Preston's ranch house for times when ranch work required his extended presence, or when they simply wanted to escape the bustle of town. With that decided, Preston wasted no time in organizing the necessary construction. By late September, work was well underway on an addition to Natalie's house that would provide a spacious bedroom, a proper dining room, and an expanded kitchen. Preston insisted on the finest materials and craftsmanship, wanting their home to reflect the permanence and quality of the life they planned to build together. "It's going to be beautiful," Natalie said one evening as they stood in the partially constructed addition, the framing complete but the walls not yet enclosed. "Though I still think you're being extravagant with those windows you ordered from Denver." Preston shrugged, unapologetic. "You love natural light for reading, and the view of the mountains from here is worth showcasing." He put an arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "Besides, I want to do this right. Our home should be a place we both love, that reflects what matters to us." Natalie leaned into him, marveling at how this strong, quiet man continued to surprise her with his thoughtfulness. "You're quite romantic beneath that stoic exterior, Preston Irwin." "Don't spread that around," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I have a reputation to maintain." As their wedding day approached, set for the first Saturday in November, Natalie found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. Less than a year ago, she had been heartbroken and humiliated in Philadelphia, fleeing west in search of a fresh start. Now, she was the proud owner of a successful bookshop, embraced by a community she had come to love, and engaged to a man whose strength, integrity, and tenderness filled her heart to overflowing. The day before the wedding, as Natalie was closing the shop early to prepare for the small dinner Rebecca had organized for that evening, the bell over the door jingled. Looking up, she was surprised to see Preston entering, as he had told her he would be busy at the ranch until evening. "Preston, I wasn't expecting you until later," she said, coming around the counter to greet him. Instead of his usual quiet smile, his expression was serious, almost troubled. "Something's happened," he said without preamble. "I need to show you something." Alarm flashed through Natalie. "What is it?" "Is everything all right at the ranch?" "The ranch is fine," he assured her quickly. "But I received a letter today delivered by a lawyer from Denver." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope, handing it to her. "It's addressed to both of us." Puzzled, Natalie opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. As she read, her confusion turned to astonishment. The letter was from a law firm in Philadelphia, informing them that Thomas Caldwell, her former fiancé, had died unexpectedly of pneumonia. More shocking was the revelation that in his will, he had left his half of her father's bookshop to Natalie, along with a letter expressing regret for his behavior and a hope that this gesture might serve as some form of atonement. "I don't understand," Natalie said, looking up at Preston. "How did they know to send this to both of us? And why now, of all times?" Preston's expression remained grave. "Read the second page." Natalie turned the letter over and continued reading. The lawyer explained that they had been attempting to locate her for several months, finally tracing her to Loveland through her correspondence with suppliers in Philadelphia. They had learned of her engagement through these same business contacts, which explained the letters addressed to both her and Preston. "He left you a successful business," Preston said quietly. "One that's worth considerably more than your shop here, according to the figures they've included." Understanding dawned on Natalie. Preston was worried that this unexpected inheritance might change her plans, might make her reconsider returning to Philadelphia, to the life and business she had left behind. "Preston," she said firmly, setting the letter aside, "if you're concerned that this changes anything about tomorrow or our future together, please don't be. Philadelphia is my past. You and Loveland are my future." Some of the tension left his shoulders, but his eyes remained troubled. "It's a significant opportunity, Natalie. Your father's shop restored to you. I wouldn't want you to reject it out of hand without proper consideration." Natalie stepped closer to him, placing her hands on his chest. "I'm not rejecting it out of hand. I'm making a considered decision based on what truly matters to me. Yes, my father's shop has sentimental value, and yes, it's probably more profitable than my little shop here. But my life is here now, my home, my community." She looked up into his face, her heart in her eyes. "My love." Preston's arms came around her, holding her close. "I just want you to be sure," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I couldn't bear it if you ever looked back with regret, wondering what might have been if you had returned to Philadelphia." "The only regret I would ever have," Natalie said softly, "is if I let fear or doubt separate me from the man I love and the life we're building together." She pulled back slightly to look into his eyes. "Besides, I've been thinking about this letter, and I believe there might be a way to honor my father's legacy while remaining here in Loveland." "What do you have in mind?" Preston asked. "I could sell my interest in the Philadelphia shop to someone who would preserve its character and purpose, perhaps the assistant manager who has been running it since Thomas fell ill. With the proceeds, we could expand Armstrong Books, perhaps even open a second location in Denver eventually." Her eyes lit with excitement at the possibility. "We could create something new together, something that honors the past while looking toward the future." Preston's expression softened, the worry in his eyes gradually replaced by admiration and love. "You continue to amaze me, Natalie Armstrong. Most people would be thrown by news like this the day before their wedding. You see it as an opportunity to build something better. That's what I've learned from you," she said simply. "To face challenges head-on and find the possibility within them." She smiled up at him. "Now, unless you have any other life-altering revelations to share, I believe we have a wedding rehearsal to attend and a dinner with friends afterward." Preston's answering smile, the full, genuine smile that she now saw regularly, but that was still rare enough to feel like a gift, warmed her heart. "No more revelations," he promised, offering his arm. "Just a future to begin building starting tomorrow." As they left the shop together, Natalie reflected that while the flood that had first brought them together had been destructive and frightening, it had ultimately delivered her to exactly where she needed to be with a man who had risked everything to reach her, and who continued to show the same courage and devotion in building their life together. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, the early November air carrying the scent of pine and the promise of the winter to come. From the window of the small room at the back of the church where she was preparing, Natalie could see the distant mountains, their peaks already dusted with snow, standing sentinel over the valley where she had found her unexpected happiness. Rebecca Turner fussed with the final details of Natalie's appearance, adjusting the simple veil that crowned her elegantly arranged hair and smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from the ivory silk of her wedding gown. "You look absolutely beautiful," Rebecca said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Preston won't be able to take his eyes off you." "Thank you," Natalie replied, her voice slightly tremulous with the emotion of the day, "for everything. Your friendship has meant so much to me since I arrived in Loveland." Rebecca's eyes misted slightly. "It's been my pleasure. Watching you and Preston find each other, seeing how happy you make one another. It's been like witnessing a perfect story unfold." A knock at the door interrupted them, and Thomas Turner poked his head in. "It's time, ladies." The church is full, and Preston is looking simultaneously terrified and more content than I've ever seen him. Natalie smiled at this description of her soon-to-be husband. It was so like Preston to maintain his composed exterior while experiencing profound emotions beneath. With a final adjustment to her veil, Natalie followed the Turners to the rear of the church, where she would begin her walk down the aisle. She had asked Thomas to escort her, having no father or male relative to perform the traditional role. As a respected friend to both her and Preston, he had been deeply honored by the request. The small church was indeed full, filled with what seemed to be the entire population of Loveland and many from the surrounding area as well. Farmers and ranchers who did business with Preston, customers from Natalie's bookshop, and the many friends they had made individually, and as a couple over the past months, all had come to celebrate their union. As the first notes of music sounded, the assembled guests rose and turned expectantly toward the back of the church. Thomas offered Natalie his arm, giving her an encouraging smile. "Ready?" he asked softly. Natalie nodded, her heart full. "More than I've ever been for anything in my life." The walk down the aisle passed in a blur of smiling faces and murmured good wishes, but Natalie's eyes were fixed on the man waiting for her at the altar. Preston stood tall and straight in a new suit made for the occasion, his dark hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. But it was his expression that captured her heart, anew the look of wonder and profound love in his blue eyes as he watched her approach, as if he could scarcely believe his good fortune. When she reached his side and Thomas placed her hand in Preston's, the warmth of his touch steadied her, grounding her in the moment and in the certainty of their shared future. The minister's words washed over them as they stood together before the altar, traditional phrases about love, honor, and commitment that took on new depth and meaning as Natalie and Preston spoke their vows to each other. Preston's voice, usually so measured and controlled, carried a depth of emotion that touched everyone present. Natalie's own vows, spoken clearly despite the happy tears that threatened, expressed the gratitude and joy she felt at having found him. When Preston slipped the simple gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, but his eyes revealed the profound significance of the moment to him. As Natalie placed his ring, a broad gold band that gleamed against his tanned skin, she felt as if they were sealing a covenant deeper than words could express. "By the authority vested in me," the minister said, his voice carrying through the church, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." With a smile, he added, "Preston, you may kiss your bride." With gentle reverence, Preston lifted Natalie's veil, his eyes never leaving hers as he lowered his head to claim her lips in a kiss that was both tender and full of promise. The church erupted in applause as they sealed their union, the genuine goodwill of the community surrounding them like an embrace. As they turned to face the congregation, now introduced as Mr. and Mrs. Preston Irwin, Natalie felt a sense of rightness and completion that transcended the happiness of the moment. This was not just the beginning of their marriage, but the continuation of a partnership that had begun the moment Preston had appeared on a makeshift raft in flood-swollen waters, risking everything to reach her. The celebration that followed at the community hall was joyous and heartfelt, with food contributed by nearly every household in town, music provided by local musicians, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Preston and Natalie moved through the gathering, accepting congratulations and well wishes, sharing moments with friends both old and new. "I've never seen Preston smile so much," Hank commented to Natalie during a quiet moment when Preston was deep in conversation with several ranchers across the room. "Used to be you'd be lucky to get a nod out of him most days. You've changed him, Mrs. Irwin." "Natalie, please," she corrected gently. "And I think we've changed each other. He's taught me about strength and perseverance, about building something lasting even after loss." Hank nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. "He's had his share of that, right enough. Lost everything in the war, came west with nothing but determination. Built the Triple P from the ground up, never complaining, never expecting anything from anyone." The old rancher's eyes softened as they moved to Preston. "Deserves this happiness, he does. Both of you do." As the evening progressed, Natalie and Preston shared several dances, moving together with the easy harmony they had discovered at their first dance months ago. During a particularly beautiful waltz, Preston drew her slightly closer than was strictly proper, his cheek nearly touching her hair as they moved to the music. "Happy?" he asked quietly for her ears alone. "Completely," she assured him, her eyes meeting his with perfect honesty. "And you?" "More than I knew was possible," he admitted, that rare full smile appearing briefly. "Though I'm finding myself increasingly eager for the dancing to end and the rest of our lives to begin." Natalie felt a blush rise to her cheeks at the implication in his words, but her answering smile held no hesitation, only joyful anticipation of the intimacy they would soon share as husband and wife. When they finally departed the celebration amid a shower of rice and good wishes, Preston helped Natalie into the waiting buggy that would take them to the ranch for their wedding night. They had decided to spend the first week of their marriage at the ranch house, away from the bustle of town, before returning to their newly expanded home above the bookshop. The journey to the Triple P passed in comfortable conversation and occasional companionable silence, both of them content in the knowledge that they had all the time in the world now to share their thoughts and dreams. When they finally arrived, the ranch house was warmly lit and welcoming, thanks to Hank's wife who had prepared it for their arrival earlier in the day. Preston lifted Natalie down from the buggy, but instead of setting her on her feet, he swept her into his arms. "Tradition," he explained with a smile as he carried her across the threshold. Inside, the simple but comfortable home reflected Preston's practical nature while also revealing touches of preparation for his bride: fresh curtains at the windows, a new quilt on the bed, wildflowers in a vase on the dining table. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irwin," Preston said softly as he set her on her feet in the center of the main room. "At least one of our homes." "It's perfect," Natalie said, turning in a slow circle to take in the space that would be part of her life now. "Just like today has been perfect." Preston stepped closer, his hands coming to rest lightly on her waist. "Is it what you imagined when you left Philadelphia?" he asked, a hint of wonder still in his voice that she had chosen this life, chosen him. Natalie shook her head, smiling up at him. "It's so much more than anything I could have imagined. I came west looking for independence and a fresh start. I found those things, yes, but I also found you, and a community, and a sense of belonging I never knew I was missing." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I found home, Preston, in Loveland, in the bookshop, but most of all in you." The love that blazed in his eyes at her words needed no verbal response. Instead, Preston lowered his head to kiss her, no longer with the restrained tenderness of their courtship, but with a deepening passion that spoke of the nights and years that lay ahead of them, nights and years in which they would discover each other fully, build their lives together, and face whatever challenges might come with the same courage and devotion that had first brought them together. Later, as they lay entwined beneath the new quilt, the moonlight casting silver patterns across the bedroom, Natalie rested her head on Preston's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. His fingers traced lazy patterns along her bare shoulder, his touch both soothing and stirring at the same time. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, pressing a kiss to her hair. Natalie smiled in the darkness. "I was thinking about the flood," she admitted. "About how something that seemed so terrifying and destructive ended up being the beginning of everything good in my life here." Preston's arms tightened around her. "I remember seeing you on that little island of land, clutching your satchel like it contained all the treasure in the world. You looked so determined, even in the face of danger." "I was terrified," Natalie confessed. "But then you appeared with that makeshift raft, and somehow I knew everything would be all right." She propped herself up on one elbow to look down at him, her hair falling like a curtain around them. "My hero coming to the rescue." In the dim light, she saw his expression grow serious. "Not a hero," he corrected gently. "Just a man who couldn't stand by and watch when others were in danger. Never thought I'd be rescuing my future wife." "Life has a way of surprising us," Natalie murmured, leaning down to kiss him softly. "And I, for one, am very grateful for the surprise." As Preston drew her back into his embrace, deepening the kiss with a renewed passion that promised to keep them awake for some time yet, Natalie reflected that while she had indeed been stranded on the wrong side of a flood all those months ago, she had ended up precisely where she was meant to be, in the arms of a man who had built a raft and come for her, and in doing so, had changed both their lives forever. The years that followed their wedding brought both joys and challenges to Preston and Natalie, as years tend to do. The expanded house above Armstrong Books became their primary home, a perfect balance between Natalie's business in town and Preston's regular trips to oversee the ranch. The bookshop continued to thrive, expanding its offerings to include educational materials for the growing school, specialized agricultural texts for the increasing number of farmers and ranchers in the area, and a carefully curated selection of novels and poetry that made Armstrong Books a cultural center of Loveland. With the proceeds from the sale of her interest in the Philadelphia shop, Natalie was able to establish a small lending library as part of the business, making books accessible to those who couldn't afford to purchase them outright. Preston's ranch prospered as well, benefiting from his forward-thinking approach to breeding and land management. The Triple P became known throughout Colorado Territory for the quality of its stock, and Preston's advice was increasingly sought by other ranchers looking to improve their operations. Their home became a gathering place for friends and community members. Rebecca and Thomas Turner remained their closest friends, their children becoming regular visitors who delighted in Aunt Natalie's endless supply of books and Uncle Preston's quiet but engaging stories of ranch life and his experiences in the West. In their second year of marriage, Natalie and Preston welcomed their first child, a son they named James Thomas Irwin, after Preston's father and Thomas Turner. The bookshop temporarily closed for a month after his birth, reopening with a new addition, a small play area where Natalie could keep the baby while she worked, much to the delight of customers who often spent as much time cooing over young James as they did browsing books. Preston proved to be a devoted father, his natural reserve melting away when it came to his son. He would often return from the ranch early to spend time with James, reading to him from simple picture books or taking him on short rides around town, the baby securely held in his strong arms. "You're a natural at this," Natalie commented one evening as she watched Preston gently rock their son to sleep, the big rancher's hands incredibly gentle as they cradled the small boy. Preston looked up with a smile that still made her heart skip. "Never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "A wife, a son, a true home. After the war, I figured I'd live out my days alone at the ranch, just me and the cattle and the land." "I'm glad you were wrong," Natalie said, coming to sit beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "So am I," he replied, leaning over to kiss her softly, careful not to disturb their sleeping son. "So very glad." 3 years later, their family expanded again with the arrival of a daughter, Eliza Rebecca Irwin, named after Natalie's cousin, who had left her the property, and Rebecca Turner, who had become like a sister to her. Eliza had Preston's blue eyes and Natalie's chestnut hair, and from an early age showed signs of inheriting both her mother's love of books and her father's quiet determination. Life wasn't without its hardships. The winter of 1876 brought record snowfalls that isolated the Triple P for weeks, forcing Preston to remain at the ranch while Natalie managed in town with the children. A drought 2 years later threatened the cattle and required Preston to make difficult decisions about culling the herd to preserve water for the strongest animals. The bookshop faced its own challenges when Harold Blackwood attempted to undercut Natalie's business by adding a substantial book section to his general store, importing volumes directly from Eastern publishers at prices Armstrong Books couldn't match. But the loyalty of Natalie's customers, combined with her superior knowledge and personalized service, allowed the bookshop to weather the competition. When Blackwood's store eventually failed due to overextension and poor management, Natalie and Preston purchased the building at auction, transforming it into an expanded Armstrong Books that included a dedicated children's section and reading room. Through it all, their partnership remained strong, built on the foundation of mutual respect and deep love that had begun that day by the flood-swollen creek. They faced each challenge together, drawing on Preston's practical strength and Natalie's resilient optimism, finding solutions that often strengthened both their business ventures and their personal bond. As the children grew, they became integral parts of both family enterprises. James showed an early aptitude for ranching, accompanying Preston to the Triple P whenever school permitted and absorbing his father's knowledge of cattle and land management. Eliza, while not uninterested in the ranch, gravitated more toward the bookshop, helping her mother organize shipments and recommend books to customers from the time she was tall enough to reach the lower shelves. "They're the perfect blend of both of us," Natalie remarked to Preston on the evening of James's 10th birthday, as they watched their children playing in the yard behind their home. "James has your quiet strength and connection to the land, while Eliza has my love of stories and people." Preston nodded, his arm around her waist as they stood together. "Good thing, too. Means the ranch and the bookshop will both have someone to carry them forward if that's what they choose." "Is that what you want for them?" Natalie asked, curious. They had never explicitly discussed their hopes for their children's futures. Preston considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "What I want," he said finally, "is for them to have choices, to find work they love and people who make them happy the way I have." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But I'll admit, the thought of James continuing the Triple P someday gives me a certain satisfaction. And Eliza with the bookshop," Natalie added with a smile. "Though I wouldn't be surprised if she expands it into Denver, the way she talks about reaching more readers." "That's your influence," Preston said, a note of pride in his voice. teaching them to dream beyond what exists now, to build something new. As the years continued to pass, Loveland grew from a small frontier town into a thriving community, boosted by the railroad and the increasing settlement of Colorado. The Triple P expanded its operations, and Armstrong Books opened a second location in the growing city of Denver, managed by a young woman Natalie had trained specifically for the role. Through it all, Preston and Natalie remained at the heart of the Loveland community, respected for their business acumen but loved for their generosity and commitment to helping others. They never forgot how their own story had begun with a devastating flood and an act of courage, and made it a point to assist those facing hardships of their own, whether through direct aid, employment opportunities, or simply the loan of a book that might provide comfort or inspiration. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their home above the bookshop, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Preston reached for Natalie's hand, his fingers entwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. 20 years, he said softly, a note of wonder in his voice. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I first saw you on that little island in the flood. Other times, it seems like you've always been part of my life. Natalie squeezed his hand, understanding exactly what he meant. The best 20 years, she replied, though I could have done without the near drowning at the beginning. Preston's laugh, once so rare but now a familiar and beloved sound, warmed her heart. Had to get your attention somehow, he teased. You might not have noticed a quiet rancher otherwise. Oh, I would have noticed you, Natalie assured him, leaning her head against his shoulder. Some things are simply meant to be, flood or no flood. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, they sat in companionable silence, still holding hands, still finding joy in each other's presence after all these years. Behind them, the sounds of their children moving about the house, James discussing ranch business with a friend who had come to dinner, Eliza reading aloud from a new novel she was considering for the shop, created a backdrop of family life that neither of them had dared to dream of when they first met. I love you, Natalie Irwin, Preston said quietly, using her married name as he sometimes did when feeling particularly reflective. More today than the day I built that raft to come for you. And I love you, Natalie replied, turning to meet his gaze, finding in his blue eyes the same steady strength and quiet devotion that had captured her heart all those years ago. My brave rancher who wasn't afraid of floodwaters or taking a chance on a bookseller from Philadelphia. As Preston leaned in to kiss her, Natalie reflected that while the flood that had first brought them together had been destructive and frightening, it had also been the beginning of the greatest blessing of her life. She had indeed been stranded on the wrong side of rising waters, but Preston had built a raft and come for her, not just rescuing her from immediate danger, but carrying her into a future filled with love, family, and a sense of belonging that she treasured beyond measure. In the end, what had seemed like disaster had proven to be destiny, a turbulent beginning that had led to the most beautiful journey of her life, one shared with the man who had risked everything to reach her and had continued to show the same courage, devotion, and love every day since. And as the stars continued to appear in the vast Colorado sky above their home, Natalie knew with absolute certainty that the adventure they had begun that day by the flood-swollen creek was far from over. There would be more challenges to face, more joys to celebrate, more moments both ordinary and extraordinary to share. But whatever came their way, they would face it as they had faced everything else together, with the same strength and love that had carried them through the waters and into each other's lives.